So I'll first, explain to you how philosophy came about. The first philosopher the first person we considered to be a philosopher in Greek history was Thales of Miletus, who lived somewhere around 6th century BC in Greece, and he was the first person to pronounce that for us to look and understand the world, mythology cannot be our only way. We must look at nature, observe nature to understand the world around us. Aristotle later recognized Thales as the first philosopher because he was the one who actually propounded this idea that there is something intrinsic to these stories and gods and all these things that where we can get our idea of the natural world from. And then there were philosophers that came after them, who we call pre-Socratics. Why do we call them pre-Socratics? Because they preceded Socrates. And the philosophers that they came after Socrates in the Greek school, they are called the Socratic philosophers. Why? Because Socrates is considered to be one of the founders of the of the Western school of philosophy, and why he was such a monumental thinker, we'll be coming to that. So the pre-Socratics, we have the Thales of Miletus, as I said, the first philosopher. We have Heraclitus, the weeping philosopher, and we have sophists who were people who trained other people in the art of debating and the art of rhetoric, so to say. After this, after these philosophers came about, they made some contributions into our, they had some their own ideas about the natural world. We had this conception of atoms that was given by a Greek philosopher whose name I'm forgetting. That also came from the Greeks, and then we had Pythagoras, who famously, who today we consider a mathematician, but then we considered a philosopher. Because remember, what philosophy actually means at its base is the love of knowledge. All knowledge, whether it be any discipline, was under the ambit of philosophy at that time. It is only later, after Enlightenment and after Renaissance, that we have divisions of knowledge into various different fields. Even if you look at for example, Isaac Newton did, we see him today as a physicist, but the title that he held was not a physicist. He was a professor of natural philosophy. So science at that time had not been conceived as a discipline. So he was a professor of natural philosophy. He studied nature. So the entirety of knowledge that we had gained from observing our surrounding was covered in the ambit of philosophy. It is only later that this knowledge is delineated. So when we say that we are studying philosophy, ancient philosophy, we are actually studying all of thought, right? But when we say modern philosophy, we have a certain idea of people who study certain things because of this specialization that later came about. So Pythagoras was, yes, we call him today a philosopher, but he was at its core, like we call him today as a mathematician, but he was at its core a philosopher. Then the most important figure that we will discuss in ancient Greek philosophy would be Socrates. He was truly an enigma, a person who used to go around. He did not actually invent a very extensive school of thought. What he did was question the way that philosophy were, the way people used to think. He famously used to go around ancient Greece and talk to many famous poets, many famous literateurs, many famous artists, and used to ask questions about their vocations, and and kept asking them questions to the point that they cannot answer this question, and everyone was annoyed with Socrates because of that. So what Socrates realized through this method that we today call the being the Socratic gadfly, the Socratic method that he used was to come to the bare bones of a concept by identifying the assumptions that we might have taken of that concept, which might not necessarily be true. So what Socrates found was that the people who were talking about the things that they were talking about, they did not really know them. They just thought that they know them. And from there, the famous doctrine came about that all I know is that I know nothing. And that is why Socrates and the oracle of that time considered Socrates to be the wisest person in Greece. But and it was then that Socrates went around and find out, and realized that it is not that he is smart. It is just that he knows that he knows nothing compared to the people who think that they know things, but they do not actually. And then, obviously, Socrates was condemned to death. The death of Socrates is perhaps one of the most important moments in the history of ancient thought, and thought took a very different turns from that point onwards. What happened was that at that time, the 30 tyrants were ruling Greece after the coup of the democratic system that they had. And they were not happy with Socrates because obviously independent thinkers are often encouraged in society. I mean, whether it be the ancients or the moderns. And what happened was that Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens, because he had become very popular among the young people of Athens, and the way of his thought had become very popular. So he was condemned to death, and the trial that the trial of Socrates is covered in one of Plato's dialogues called the Apology. But that the apology literally means defense. It is not that he did not apologize to anything. Far from it, he refused to even concede for any drop of mercy that went away from his principle. And Socrates did not write anything. Most of what we know of Socrates, of course, comes from his student Plato and historian Xenophon and other students that he had that wrote about him. So the trial of Socrates happens, and Socrates refuses to concede, and there is every historical document that we have confirms that if Socrates had probably sort of had begged for his life, or probably appealed to the emotional sensitive sensibilities of the people of Athens who were the members of the jury, he would probably he would have been forgiven. But he did not even concede that what he was doing was wrong. So that is why he was condemned to death. And even while going to drink his vial of poison and ultimately die, Socrates said that you're cowards if you fear, you are irrational people if you fear death, because we know not what will happen after death. It will either be a dreamless sleep, which is not something to be afraid of, or it will be a life that is detached of your bodily proclivities, which are not a very positive thing in itself. So why do you fear death? It is irrational to fear death. So, and that is the last thing that he said before dying. So it is natural that we reverse, or the Western school of philosophy reverse him in the manner that it does. And his student Plato become really distraught with life, and spent most of his time traveling around, and going around. I mean, he left Greece, traveled around, because he was very distraught with the civilization. He was very distraught with after the death of his teacher, his beloved teacher Socrates. And then he wrote extensively in his dialogues and established the academia in ancient Greece, which was first established school of teaching of philosophy in the world. And that is where the word academy comes from. Academics comes from the academia of Plato. Uh, and then Plato went on to espouse his own form of philosophy, which was the idealistic world of forms, that all the knowledge we know already exists. It is just that we have to discover it through our rational processes. And then Plato's student Aristotle was the next big philosopher. He did not agree with Plato on many points. He believed that this rationalist world of forms is something that it is an idealistic conception which does not find which does not find any grounds in reality and in nature. So Aristotle's idea was more to look for knowledge in nature and things around him, and observing the world around him, instead of doing abstract reasoning to figure out things. And this is a sort of debate that would go on for centuries and centuries, even after the death of Plato and Aristotle, because Aristotle was doing a very ancient version of what we call science, that is observing the world around us, and trying to figure out the things from them, and using the method of deduction, the Socratic deduction, which we call syllogisms, that were invented by Aristotle, the syllogisms we studied. uh, and from that, from Aristotle we have the academia, which goes on running. And after Aristotle, we come to the Hellenistic age. And the Hellenistic age was an age of chaos. It was age of disruption. There were wars, there were conquest. They were, every day a new king will be ruling over you.
Powerful.
It was an age where there was a lack of stability in society. In that age, we had several schools of thought. We had Epicurus, who was the father of hedonism. He said that a life of virtue is a life that is led seeking pleasure and avoiding pain, and not just short-term pleasure that we associate hedonism with, but long-term pleasure, and that comes from simplicity and comes from austerity. And then we had the three big schools of the Hellenistic age, that is cynicism,
Stoic.
stoicism, and skepticism. Yeah, Anand is very
My
happy.
favorite one is Stoic. My favorite one is Stoic. So yeah.
Yeah. So cynics were the people who said that they were basically the ancient version of reject modernity and return to monkey mean. They basically said that the virtuous life is one that is led in harmony with nature. One of the most notorious cynic philosophers was actually Diogenes, who famously used to live in a tub in a town square, and uh, he abandoned all earthly belongings that he had. He only used to carry a cup, from which he used to drink water, which he threw away when he saw a child drinking water from his hand in a town square one fine day. And he was not known for civilization propriety. There is a famous philosophical joke that once when Plato was teaching in his academy, Diogenes, Plato said, what is man? They were thinking about the concept of man. So Plato said that a man is a featherless biped. And then what happened? Diogenes notoriously, entered the academia the next day with a chicken with its feathers plucked out and said, "Behold, Socrates, man." And obviously he was not known for his propriety. He used to masturbate in town squares. He used to, disrupt
Okay.
theatrical performances in
So
ancient
you
Greece.
should have started from that part, man. You should have started from that part.
So
There
yeah,
is where like
Diogenes is a very
you.
interesting philosopher. You should go and read him. He's the, one of
I
the.
thought I was talking. I thought I will talk about the philosophy of Hinduism next, but okay, okay. So
So we have
if I will
covered
start from that,
yeah, we had kind of covered
okay.
this. And we'll come, after we have covered everything, we'll have time for discussion. Anand, we'll give you full time to talk about your views about philosophy.
So
Don't worry.
you are really going like a class-wise, like a discussion of philosophy. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So next we have the school of Stoicism. The difference between Stoicism and Stoicism was that both believe that we should be one with the nature. That
Okay,
is the
Mike.
way to lead a virtuous life. But they had different conceptions of nature. Cynicism had the pure conception of nature, that it is the trees and the woods and everything around us. But Stoics considered the Stoics considered society to also be the part of nature itself. So living in harmony with nature was also living in harmony with society, living in harmony with other people, right? And basically Stoicism was a derivative philosophy of cynicism. And obviously Stoicism, to live in harmony with nature, would also mean to live in a world where people constantly annoy you, but you will still have to live in harmony with them. We had some great philosophers from that school. We had Marcus Aurelius, who was a king, but at the same time a philosopher. We had Seneca, who famously said that why cry over parts of lives when the whole of it is when the whole of it calls for tears. And we had Marcus Aurelius, who was a king. I mean, we cannot go in detail with their philosophies, but I would like to just give small quibbings of what these philosophers were known for. Marcus Aurelius has this famous meditation, which goes on great detail explaining his life. I will read it to you. It is something that I have stored in my pins, and I read anytime that I'm feeling a bit down, or I'm feeling a bit annoyed by the people around me. So it goes like this: begin each day by telling yourself, today I shall be meeting ingratitude, insolence, disloyalty, ill will, and selfishness. All of them due to offenders' ignorance of what is good or evil. But for my part, I have long perceived the nature of good and its nobility, the nature of evil and its meanness, and also the nature of the culprit himself, who is my brother or sister, not by blood, but endowed with the same reason and the same share of divine as me. I cannot be angry at them, for they and I are born to work together, like two hands, feet, or eyelids, or like two rows of teeth. To obstruct each other is against the law of nature, And what is irritation or observer or aversion but a form of obstruction? Then we have discussed the three schools of the Hellenistic age. Then a lot of philosophy was happening. There was a school of thought that was called the Neoplatonism, which derived from Plato's ideas of an ideal world and forms. They conceive the worlds in three levels. Basically, one is the base physical reality. Then we have the higher reality to which we have don't have access to, which is the reality of transcendence. And then we had the top, which is the singularity or the god or whatever you like to call it. So this three-tier figure of reality was constructed by the Neoplatonists. Then we had Arabic philosophers, of whom we owe a great deal of favor, because almost none of the original manuscripts of that Greek pates, Greek era survives. How do we know what we know about these Greek people? Because when the Arabics traveled to Greece by means of trade, they took these manuscripts and they translated them, and they preserved them, and they did the same with India, and they did the same with abroad. I mean, we really owe a lot for to the Arabic civilization, because they really preserved the knowledge from all across the times. Then we had the Greek philosophers, Avicenna, and others, but we'll not go into detail with them. We had and then Europe in the beginning of the 10th 11th century. We had Thomas Aquinas and all these philosophers who were contemplating on the idea of God. Okay, who God is, whether he exists or not. I mean, there are many problems that comes with the conception of God. For example, we say that God is omnipotent, we say God is omnipresent, we say that God is omniscient, we say that God is all good, right? But let's take this example. For example, if God is all good, then why? And if God is all powerful, then why does evil exist? That is the problem of the evil, right? I mean, God is all good, so he should not want evil. But God is also all powerful, so why does he not finish evil altogether? So that means that either the God is not all powerful or he's not all good, right? I mean, these are some contradiction that come with the conception of Judeo-Christian God, and these philosophers were mulling about all these things. But we'll not go into great detail with them. What I want to approach towards you is towards enlightenment, which is where actually modern philosophy began. Can anyone tell me what is Renaissance? Just because people want some, people obviously are getting bored with my monologues. I will just pitch in. Someone explain, kindly explain who has a bare bones idea about what Renaissance was. Anyone? Samarth, Anand, Anand.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah. So you want to explain what Renaissance was?
Okay, so I like completely lost, because my network was like,
Oh,
okay.
okay. So we're
Okay.
basically talking about the conception of modern philosophy that came with the Renaissance. Okay, I'll just explain it. Does anyone want to explain, or should I go?
Okay, so I know the basic idea about that. So
Yeah.
it was a
Explain.
fervent period of like European culture. Okay,
Hmm.
so uh, it started around like 14th century or 17th century. The period was like divided between 14th or 17th century, if I'm not wrong.
Hmm.
So what it promoted was the I won't say discovery, I will say the rediscovery, because see, the thing is that classical philosophy and the literature and arts and all sort of things were there from the beginning itself. But the thing is that they were like kind of lost. Okay.
Hmm.
So during that period, during the 14th and 17th century, because this is a century after the Dark Ages, I like to call them like Ages because of the crucifixion and the Crusaders. So sorry, not crucifixion, the Crusaders and all the wars and whatnot. So the Renaissance period was like the rebirth of these like philosophy, literature, and art, and there were many schools
Hmm.
which were the like part of this. And some of the greatest thinkers, authors, scientists like Leonardo da Vinci being one of them, they were like a direct product of this period. So I say that if I have to define this period, I will say like from darkness to light. This is where the Renaissance like really
Hmm.
begins during the Middle Ages, from
Hmm.
darkness to the light. you
Okay.
know
Okay.
so yeah.
Yeah.
So it started after the,
that's enough. Thank you, Anand. So yeah, I mean, I think everyone has an idea like about the
yeah,
basics of Renaissance, right? So basically, what Renaissance was that as we discussed, these philosophies of 11th, 12th century, they focused a lot on the concept of God and whether God exists and how does God work. So philosophy was sort of intersecting with theology in that area. But what Renaissance did was to detach the idea of thought and free the thought from the constraints of orthodoxy, right? Which was that you begin with the assumption that that there is something like a god, or something like that. I mean, that is true. I mean, because how will people know about all these Greek philosophies and everything? That was not talked about. Obviously, the church was one of the most important and one of the most powerful institutions at that time, and they suppressed all the Greek works and all these philosophies and all their mythology, because they thought that that went against the Judeo-Christian idea of God, and they were pagan texts, and they should be done away with, and that they were what the heretic texts they were, so they were called. So their study was not encouraged. But with the advent of humanism, we had a sort of rebirth of this idea that that we should look, there was a rebirth of the idea of humanism, right? That we should
yeah.
focus on human suffering and human problem and human achievements and human reason, instead of looking to above for knowledge. That was the I mean, the Renaissance was about a lot of things, but that is, I think, the
And
basics.
if you're mentioning that,
Yeah.
the most important thing that happened during that period, from
Mm,
my point of view, is in 1450s or 55, if I'm not wrong,
mm.
the Gutenberg printing press, right?
Yeah. That
So
there were many,
that thing also happened.
that there were many
Yeah.
factors why Renaissance was accelerated and came into being. But obviously, we don't have the time to discuss this. Let's just move on with the discussion. So the father of perhaps all of modern philosophy was Rene Descartes, which you might remember from your maths class, the Cartesian plane. Obviously, he did mathematics, but he was obviously a philosopher, like all people who were trying to figure out knowledge in their time. He was a philosopher. So he wrote the book that was called Meditations on the First Philosophy, which is a work of like with the basic question that he asked is that how do we know that I know anything? You know, where if there is no if we believe like how should we believe anything which is not based in an assumption which might be untrue? Okay, so I mean, how do we know anything? How do we know anything, right? It runs into that sort of problem. He said that for all we know, the reality that we see around us is just a fabrication. There might be an evil demon that might be sitting behind us, trying to manipulate us into a sort into thinking that the reality is actually the way it is, but it is actually the way it is not. So the basic idea that Descartes gave to philosophy was cogito ergo sum. That is, I think, therefore I am, which means that because by the virtue of the fact that I am a thinking being, I know that I exist. I don't know if anything around me exists. I know that I myself exist because I am a thinking being. Now, my job is to figure out everything else that is around me through faculties of reason, of your your sense organs or anything like that. So that again goes into I mean, and then we had people doing philosophy later. We had developments in political thought. We had Hobbes, which we'll study in jurisprudence. I mean, that is the beginning of jurisprudence as a study. Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan, and but we'll just restrict ourselves and go further. There were many philosophers who came after that. There was and more importantly, there was a divide that came between the two schools of philosophy that were existing in that existed in Europe in the during the Renaissance period. That was the divide between continental rationalist and the British empiricist. All right. So the continental rationalists were the people who thought that that we should reason out the truth, because our sense organs cannot be trusted, right? And then we had because our sense organs are sort of, yeah, they are fallible, and we can they're not really reliable. So we should rely on reason to figure out the truth instead of relying on our senses. British empirics, on the other hand, found that abstract method of reasoning They did not see a lot of virtue in that. They preferred looking around the world and observing things, observing the natural world to sort of deduce the concepts of philosophy. And one of the most important philosophers that I think one of the most important philosophers in all of philosophy that came after them was Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant was really the person who sort of ended the sort of this divide between a continental rationalist or and the British empiricist. He basically said that the world that we see the world that we see through our eyes, the world that is around us, is different from the world that it actually is, because our sense organs are very limited in their perception. The world that we see, or the phenomena that we observe around us, are part of the phenomenal world, right? But that is not the ultimate reality, which he called the noumenal world, right? That there's a distinction between the phenomenal world and the noumenal world came. So he says that the nominal reality is something that that is beyond us. We cannot observe it, we cannot talk about it. So what's the point of even thinking about it? Let's not think about it. Let's observe the phenomenal reality, which is the reality that is around us, which we can think, which we can interact with. And that is how Kant proceeded. And he wrote a lot of good books, especially the three
Yeah.
critiques: the critique of judgment, the critique of pure reason, and and one more critique, I forgot its name. If anyone remembers, okay, we'll come. So that was
Magnum
basically,
opus. Yeah,
yeah,
there
that
was
was
some
basically
great works. Yeah.
Kant. Kant, worked a lot on, in the knowledge of how we know things, and also the knowledge of ethics. But let's just move forward and just cover the rest of the works in philosophy. So
The
Kant,
nebula hypothesis too. Yeah.
yeah. So the Kant's basically idea was that there is a sort of the nature of human reality is only observed. It can only be known through observation of the phenomenal world, and the noumenal world is beyond us. All right. Then came the philosopher that added to that was Hegel. Now Hegel is an important philosopher because he was the one that went on to influence Marx. So it is important to remember him. So Hegel basically said that the nature of human philosophy is not something that we sit and we just keep thinking about it, and then we will come at a perfect understanding of human nature, because human nature in itself is not something static. It is something that changes with times and epochs and eras, right? He famously gave the dialectic of the dialectic process of history, which is that we have one stream of ideas and thoughts and societal conventions that are called the thesis. And to oppose that thesis, we there is an antithesis, right? And from that antithesis we have a synthesis. That is the Hegel's dialectic, which went on to influence Karl Marx. What Karl Marx basically said, he applied this dialectic process of history to the world, the materialist world around him. He famously coined the theory of dialectic materialism, which is that the dialectic process of history is guided by the reality that is the dialectic process of history is guided by the materialist changes in society that occurs in a dialectic manner. For example, we had the feudal society. Let's say the feudal society is the thesis, right? Which had many hierarchies which were unjust, and which were which were, I mean, there were a lot of problems with the feudal society, the way it worked, and it was not working. So then we had the antithesis to it. An antithesis was a movement for liberation, for example, the French Revolution, or whatever various uprisings against feudalism. So from that sense, from that thesis and antithesis, we had a synthesis, which was the liberal capitalist society, right, which came out from feudalism, because it was a synthesis of these contrasting ideas in the feudal society. So that is how also Marx goes on to sort of do philosophy in that manner, and conceives an ultimate end version of reality, right? which comes at the end of history, something that Hegel called the end of history, which is the point where this dialectic process of history ceases. And that is the point that that is the point where the reality, the dialectic process ceases and the reality just stays the way it is. So for Marx, the state of communism is a state of classless, workless, moneyless society where everyone gives according to their needs, and gives according to their capacity and takes according to their needs, is an end of a history conception that the dialectic process of history basically results in, where the thesis and the antithesis stop happening, and ultimately we have this society which is this which stays, which is the basically the perfect version of reality, which you can say in very crude terms. But yeah, that was the basic idea. Then we, after Karl Marx, obviously, Karl Marx. I don't think that I need to tell anyone the influence that Karl Marx ideas had upon upon civilization. I mean, the entirety of 20th century history was influenced by Marx ideas. We had revolutions, we had wars, we had the Cold War, and all these things. I mean, and then we had the new Marxist philosophers who started criticizing Marx's basic theories, and all these things. So and then basically we reach the philosophy of 20th century. Now 20th century is a very interesting time in philosophy, because we to go back a bit further, we had Charles Darwin give release his work, which basically did away with which proved basically beyond reasonable
The
doubt,
origin of species.
the origin of species, which basically proved beyond the doubt that this Judeo-Christian conception of God with the Adam and Eve and everything is false, because we have evolved from animals, right? We have evolved from it's we have not evolved from animals. We have evolved as from primitive species to advanced one. Thank you. We have evolved from a primitive species to advanced one through the process of evolution. So God does not exist. What do we do now? So yeah, that is where my meme comes from. Meaning.exe has stopped working. Kindly, choose one of your fighters. So the fighters came in the form of the existential school of philosophy. God was basically, the source of being, and all sorts of community in society. Now that is done away with. What do we do now? Right. Okay, what do we do now? Let's figure it out. Then came the thought of existentialism. Now, existential thought of philosophy, I mean, that is like one of the most famous form of philosophy among the popular culture, and that is the most memed part of philosophy as well, because of its
Yeah.
with the general themes that it adopts. So basically, I'll explain what existentialism means. So basically, the idea that there is an essence of something, right? The essence of something, where is that is the purpose of a thing, that why a thing exists. Greek philosophers used to think that the essence of the thing, that the essence of the thing precedes its existence. Because there is a grand narrative of why a thing exists, and that is from where the thing comes into existence, right? But existential, because now existential school of philosophy rejected that essentialist school of philosophy, which basically said, oh, because there is no God, because there is no higher reality from which we can derive our existence, our existence comes first. Now we have to find an essence to it, because what do we do now, basically, that kind of situation.
Yeah. The
So
people here are in doldrums, like, what do we do now? Right.
yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, from that, from there we go on to how.
Now we won't go. Now we will stop. Come on, man. Now we will stop and let people speak. Like, there are
No,
10
no.
people here who have go to
We'll
tell.
just we'll just
Like,
we'll just end it, just with explaining, okay, the end of existential philosophy. Okay, so basically,
okay, okay,
how do we lead existence
okay.
in a godless world? That was basically answered by people like where there is no essence. How do we philosophize now? That was basically the question answered by philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and people who came from the existentialist school. Now, after existentialism, we had a movement in 20th century philosophy that sort of started questioning the essence of philosophy itself, which was that we say that we can use reason and observation to sort of figure out the world, but is reason actually a tool through which we can know things? because that is the conception that we had. Okay, if only we that came with Renaissance, let's not accept dogma, let's keep reasoning, because when we keep reasoning, that is how we sort of reach an ultimate conception of truth. We will the grand truth we will reach that we will reach will come to us through reason. Now that basic premise was started being questioned by I think one of the philosophers who laid the foundation to that was Ludwig Wittgenstein, who wrote Tractatus Logicus Philosophicus, the TLP, which is a very important text in the philosophy of language. That's where the philosophy of language starts. He basically said that all that we do in, because he basically he just wrote two texts, Ludwig Wittgenstein. The first text, he said that, he somewhat quite grandly assumed that that was the end of philosophy. He wrote that Tractatus would be the last the last text of philosophy, because philosophy cannot go on anywhere from here. He basically said that language is not an adequate tool for philosophical analysis on which we base a reason from, and because of that we cannot do philosophy. End of the story. Philosophy has ended. Now let's go home. Right. But what happened later was that after a few years he came back to university and academia, and
There is more, guys.
thinking
I,
about this idea that has he really ended philosophy. He
Mhm.
started having doubts. So
Oh
then
my God, notes.
then he wrote the
Mhm.
second and his last book, Philosophical Investigations, in which basically he revisited that idea and basically said that all of philosophy is, or all what language does is play these language games, which is like we are reasoning for a certain purpose, we are reasoning for a certain heuristic ability, we're reasoning for a utility that the engaging in conversation brings us. For example, when we are reasoning with a person who wants to achieve a rational end, right? Let's make a philosophy club, and how will we run that philosophy club? That when we reason through in that manner, we are reasoning to figure out the best way to do something, right? But example, when someone is sad that that they failed their assignment, do you sit there and lecture them for half an hour about how to do, how they could not have failed the assignment? No, you engage in consolation through by means of language. So there are different language uses of language, and these language games we play for different purposes. So that is what basically Wittgenstein said. And then from there on, we had, from philosophers like Lyotard and Foucault and everything, we had the concept of postmodern philosophy. That is the modernist conception of philosophy that came with the Enlightenment, was done away with. And it was no longer believed that there is can be an absolute grand narrative, the grand truth to everything, and everything must be studied in its own, in its sort of through, because and the philosophy in itself is inherently limited tool, because we cannot arrive at a grand truth to reason. So Gilles Deleuze, Foucault, we had Baudrillard were some famous thinkers from this school, and it is the one of the most popular contemporary schools that exists today. And that is where most of the contemporary philosophy is taking place. All right. Okay, so I think I have wasted more than the time that was, I think, necessary for me to waste. But
So
I think you must have got क्या कहते हैं, basic bare bones idea of what philosophy is, right? I hope.
people are finding it interesting, man. Yeah.
Are they?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
That is great. I mean that you will not leave the group, and the club will not be abandoned mid semester. Then I'm assuming.
Yeah.